The darkness was absolute. There was no sky, no horizon, no sense of time. Only twisted metal, cold water, and silence. In May 2013 in the Gulf of Guinea off the coast of Nigeria, the tugboat Jaskin 4 capsized during a storm and sank to a depth of about 30 meters. Most of the crew died on impact or drowned within minutes. But one man remained alive inside the submerged hull. His name was Harrison Okene, the ship's cook. On the morning of the accident, the sea was rough as the Jaskin 4 operated near an oil platform. Strong waves struck the vessel, but nothing seemed unusual for that kind of offshore operation. Then a more violent wave hit with enough force to destabilize the tug. The vessel tilted abruptly. Within seconds it flipped completely. Water flooded the compartments. Objects were hurled through the air. Men were thrown against walls and steel structures. It happened too fast for most to react. Harrison was in the bathroom when he felt the impact. He immediately knew something was wrong. The tilt was sudden. Water began rushing in. Instinctively he tried to find an exit, but corridors were already filling. Doors became difficult to open due to pressure. Instead of trying to reach the deck, now inverted and submerged, he searched for air. He made his way into a cabin where a pocket of air was trapped beneath the overturned structure. When the vessel finally struck the seabed, upside down, he was still inside. And still alive. At 30 meters deep, pressure is roughly 4 times greater than at the surface. Light barely penetrates. Cold accelerates the body's heat loss. And the oxygen inside a sealed space gradually diminishes. Harrison understood that he could not waste energy, or air. He had to stay calm. He found a small space where the inverted ceiling created a breathable air pocket. Part of his body remained submerged, increasing the risk of hypothermia. He felt his way through the darkness. At some point he realized he was not alone. The bodies of crewmates were nearby. Most of the crew had not survived. Hours passed without any sense of time. No light. No clock. No contact with the outside world. He found a bottle of soda and drank it to stay minimally hydrated. Seawater was not an option. Every breath had to be controlled. He began to pray. According to his later accounts, he repeated psalms quietly to keep his mind focused and prevent panic. Faith became a psychological survival tool. In extreme isolation, the mind can unravel quickly. He needed clarity. Meanwhile, on the surface, recovery operations began, initially to retrieve bodies. No one imagined that anyone could still be alive after so many hours underwater. The Jaskin 4 lay upside down on the seabed. The mission was body recovery, not rescue. Divers were sent to inspect the interior of the hull. Inside the wreck, Harrison heard distant sounds. Metallic vibrations. Knocking. He did not know whether they were real or if his mind was beginning to create stimuli. But the sounds grew clearer. Divers were cutting and exploring the structure. After nearly 60 hours on the ocean floor, someone was there. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary underwater survival stories ever recorded, but we have not yet reached the moment of direct contact. The moment when a diver, expecting to find only bodies, extended his hand into the darkness and touched the hand of a living man. The divers who descended to the wreck of the Jaskin 4 were not searching for survivors. Their mission was body recovery. More than 2 days had passed since the capsizing. The assumption was simple. No one could possibly still be alive inside. The water was murky. The vessel, lying upside down, had become a disorienting maze of narrow passageways. Every movement required caution. Loose cables, floating debris, and twisted metal turned the interior into a dangerous labyrinth. The divers advanced slowly, their flashlights briefly illuminating fragments of steel and dense shadows. Inside one of the cabins, a diver approached what appeared to be a body. He reached out and touched it. Then something unexpected happened. The hand he touched moved. It was not a corpse. It was Harrison Okene. The diver recoiled for a split second, startled. Then he returned, shining his light more carefully into the space. There, inside an air pocket formed by the inverted ceiling, was a thin, exhausted man, partially submerged, but alive. After nearly 60 hours on the ocean floor, someone was breathing inside that hull. The moment was captured on video by the divers themselves, real footage that would later circulate around the world. The shock in the diver's voice is unmistakable when he realizes he has found a survivor. But discovering Harrison was only the beginning of a new challenge. Getting him out would not be simple. The first risk was physiological. Harrison had been breathing compressed air at a depth of 30 meters. At that depth, ambient pressure is about 4 times greater than at the surface. His body had temporarily adapted to that pressure. If he were brought up too quickly, he could suffer severe decompression sickness, the same danger faced by divers who ascend too rapidly. He was also physically weakened. He had spent nearly 3 days partially submerged in cold water, with minimal hydration. The divers supplied him with an air mask to stabilize his breathing. He would need to be brought out under controlled conditions and undergo proper decompression procedures. In that instant, the operation transformed completely. It was no longer body recovery. It was a rescue. Harrison was carefully guided out of the wreck and brought toward the surface under technical supervision. From there, he was placed inside a decompression chamber. He remained there for roughly 2 additional days, allowing his body to gradually adjust back to normal atmospheric pressure. The danger did not end once he left the water. Sudden pressure changes can cause nitrogen bubbles to form in the bloodstream, affecting the brain, lungs, and joints. The rescue team understood that his survival now depended not only on the resilience that kept him alive for 60 hours, but also on the precision of post-rescue medical protocol. He endured the treatment. And he survived. The psychological impact was immense. He had spent nearly 3 days in total darkness, surrounded by bodies, hearing nothing but water and metal. Then suddenly, light from a diver's torch and the touch of a human hand. The transition was abrupt. Later, Harrison explained that he survived by staying calm and praying constantly. Faith became his primary psychological anchor. He believed he would be rescued. That belief helped him control panic and conserve air. After his recovery, he received medical and psychological support. In a decision that surprised many, he later chose to pursue professional dive training. Rather than develop a permanent fear of the sea, he sought to understand it more deeply. The story quickly gained international attention. The video of the diver discovering Harrison alive inside the submerged vessel became concrete proof of one of the most extraordinary modern maritime survival cases ever recorded. But behind the viral footage lies an essential truth. He did not survive by pure miracle alone. He survived because he found an air pocket, because he controlled his breathing, because he drank liquid when he could, because he avoided panic, because the dive team followed strict decompression protocols. The combination of these factors created a probability that was extremely small, but not impossible. To fully understand what happened to Harrison Okene, it is necessary to understand how that air pocket could exist in the first place. When the Jaskin 4 capsized and sank, it went down upside down. That meant compartments that had originally been near the ceiling became inverted chambers where air could become trapped. As water flooded the hull, not every space filled immediately. In areas where doors were closed or structural barriers formed natural seals, air remained compressed inside. That air was not static. At a depth of 30 meters, surrounding water pressure is roughly 4 atmospheres, about 4 times the pressure at the surface. The air inside the compartment was compressed, becoming denser. This reduced the volume of the air pocket, but the oxygen concentration initially available was still sufficient to sustain breathing, for a limited time. The real danger was not only oxygen depletion, but carbon dioxide buildup. In a sealed environment, CO2 accumulation can cause confusion, panic, unconsciousness, and death even before oxygen is completely exhausted. Harrison survived in part because the space he occupied was relatively large for a single person and because he controlled his breathing. Excess movement or panic would have accelerated oxygen consumption and CO2 buildup. He remained as still as possible. In silence. In total darkness. Temperature was another critical factor. The water in that region is not as frigid as the North Atlantic, but it is still cold enough to induce hypothermia when a person remains partially submerged for extended periods. Part of Harrison's body was underwater, increasing heat loss. To reduce this effect, he tried to position himself so that as much of his torso as possible stayed above the waterline. But it was impossible to remain completely dry. 60 hours in those conditions is not merely physical endurance. It is mental endurance. Extreme sensory isolation is psychologically devastating. Without light, the brain loses its sense of time. Minutes stretch into hours. Hours blur into something indefinite. The mind begins to generate its own stimuli. Harrison later reported hearing sounds and being unsure whether they were real or imagined. When the divers finally arrived, his first reaction was not to scream. It was to reach out. The hand that moved in the darkness was the first human contact after nearly 3 days alone inside a sunken vessel. There is also an important technical dimension to the rescue. Commercial offshore divers often operate under strict depth and pressure protocols. Regardless of the specific company involved that day, one principle is universal. Extracting someone from 30 meters requires controlled ascent procedures. If Harrison had been brought directly to the surface without proper decompression, he could have suffered gas embolism or severe decompression sickness. Nitrogen dissolved in the bloodstream under pressure can form dangerous bubbles during rapid ascent. For that reason, after he was found, he was supplied with breathing apparatus and integrated into a controlled extraction process. He was later placed inside a hyperbaric chamber. He spent approximately 2 days undergoing decompression. Surviving inside the wreck was only half the battle. Surviving the return to the surface was the other half. The story resonated globally because of its symbolism. A man trapped at the bottom of the sea. 60 hours in darkness. Surrounded by deceased crewmates. Waiting for something that, rationally, seemed impossible. But what makes the story even more powerful is that it does not involve futuristic technology or elite military training. Harrison was a cook. His survival tools were emotional control. Slow breathing. Faith. Stillness. He did not fight the water. He adapted to the space that remained. After the rescue, he reported symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. Nightmares, anxiety, difficulty sleeping. Such reactions align with prolonged isolation and exposure to death in confined space. Yet he made a surprising decision. Instead of avoiding the sea, he chose to study professional diving. That decision reveals something profound about resilience. Survival is not only about escaping death. It is about deciding what to do with life afterward. After Harrison Okene emerged from the decompression chamber and began breathing surface air again, the story was far from over. Physically he had survived. But survival does not mean walking away unharmed. In the weeks that followed, psychological effects began to surface. He reported frequent nightmares, vivid flashbacks of the darkness, and the sensation of being surrounded by bodies. The human brain is not built to endure nearly 3 days of absolute isolation in a hostile environment. Total absence of light disrupts the biological clock. Prolonged exposure to extreme stress activates survival mechanisms that do not simply switch off once the danger ends. He had to relearn how to sleep without imagining rising water. He had to relearn how to breathe without counting every inhale. His case also drew attention from the professional diving community. Until then, surviving 60 hours inside a submerged vessel was considered extraordinarily unlikely. What his experience demonstrated was that air pockets can remain viable for significant periods, depending on the vessel's internal structure, the volume of trapped air, and the number of people breathing within that space. He was alone. That was decisive. If more people had shared the same air pocket, oxygen would have been consumed faster and carbon dioxide would have accumulated more quickly, likely turning the space lethal much sooner. Experts also examined the depth factor. 30 meters is significant, but not extreme for commercial diving operations. That made a technically controlled rescue possible. At much greater depths, the scenario would have been far more complex. Another crucial factor was his behavior. Panic is one of the greatest enemies in confined survival situations. Rapid breathing increases oxygen consumption and accelerates CO2 buildup. Excessive movement wastes both energy and body heat. Harrison did the opposite. He remained as still as possible. He controlled his breathing. He prayed to maintain mental focus. This reduced energy expenditure and preserved the available air for longer. It was not physical strength that kept him alive. It was mental discipline. After recovering, he made a decision that surprised many. He chose to train as a professional diver. Instead of developing a permanent aversion to the ocean, he chose to confront it with technical knowledge. The decision was not impulsive. It was gradual. He wanted to understand the environment that had nearly killed him. That choice reveals something profound about human resilience. Some people avoid trauma. Others attempt to master it. He chose the second path. International attention followed quickly. The video capturing the moment a diver reached out and touched his hand inside the submerged hull became visual proof of an event that seemed almost fictional. But behind the viral impact lies a simple reality. He was in the right place within a disaster. He found a space with enough air. He maintained emotional control. And he was found before the oxygen ran out. The combination of those factors created a narrow window of survival, a window that nearly closed. There is also the spiritual dimension he himself emphasized. During those 60 hours he repeated psalms and prayers. Faith did not change the physics of the environment. It did not alter the water pressure. But it changed his capacity to endure isolation. In extreme conditions the mind needs an anchor. For him that anchor was faith. Harrison Okene's case entered modern maritime history as one of the most extraordinary underwater survival stories ever documented. Not because of advanced technology, but because of something more fundamental. Come. Time. 60 hours. At the bottom of the sea. Waiting for someone to come. And someone did. There is still one dimension that must be explored more deeply before closing this story: the biological limits of the human body under submerged confinement. When the Jaskin 4 sank, Harrison Okene was not simply trapped inside a ship. He was trapped in an environment combining 4 critical stressors: increased pressure, constant cold, limited oxygen, and absolute isolation. Any one of those factors can be dangerous on its own. Combined, they are potentially lethal. At a depth of 30 meters, the air he was breathing was compressed to roughly 4 times surface pressure. That means each breath contained more molecules per volume, but the total oxygen available in the air pocket was finite. With every inhale, oxygen levels dropped and carbon dioxide levels rose. Elevated CO2 in the bloodstream causes headaches, dizziness, confusion, panic, and eventually unconsciousness. The fact that he remained lucid for so long suggests 2 things. The air pocket was relatively larger than one might assume, and he conserved every breath. He did not scream. He did not thrash. He did not waste oxygen in panic. He waited. Body position also mattered. Part of him remained submerged in seawater. Water conducts heat approximately 25 times faster than air. Even in tropical regions, prolonged partial immersion leads to gradual hypothermia. Hypothermia is not just feeling cold, it is progressive failure of the body's systems. He survived because he managed to keep as much of his torso as possible above the waterline inside the air pocket, reducing heat loss. Small physical adjustments made enormous differences. There is also the question of perceived time. In total darkness, the brain loses circadian reference. Without cycles of light and shadow, the body cannot distinguish day from night. This leads to profound disorientation. People subjected to complete sensory deprivation often report distorted time perception, auditory hallucinations, and loss of spatial awareness. Harrison later said he heard sounds and could not tell whether they were real. When he finally detected the divers, he was not immediately certain it was not his imagination. In extreme isolation, the line between external stimulus and internal projection becomes fragile. The rescue itself was also a matter of applied science. Bringing him out of that environment required managing 2 simultaneous risks: decompression sickness and physiological collapse from shock, hypothermia, or exhaustion. That is why he was transferred to a hyperbaric chamber after a controlled ascent. His survival did not end when he saw the diver's light. It ended days later when he exited the chamber safely. But perhaps the most powerful part of the story lies beyond physiology. It lies in the mental decision not to surrender. For nearly 3 days he had no confirmation that anyone was searching for him. There was no guarantee of rescue. Statistically, survival seemed unlikely. Yet he maintained an internal structure: slow breathing, repeated prayer, focus on the present moment. In extreme conditions, the mind can accelerate death, or delay it. He chose to delay it. And then came life after the ocean floor. He became a symbol of extreme survival. He gave interviews. He told his story in detail. And most importantly, he continued living. He chose to train as a professional diver. That was not merely a career decision. It was psychological confrontation. He did not allow the ocean to become a permanent ghost in his life. He transformed trauma into direction. There is still one essential layer before a final conclusion: what Harrison Okene's story reveals about the line between survival and surrender. When the Jaskin 4 capsized and sank, logic suggested that no one could survive. 30 meters below the surface, hull inverted, compartments flooded, no communication. Statistically, the survival window was minimal. But human survival is rarely just statistics. Inside that compressed air pocket, Harrison faced 3 simultaneous threats: finite oxygen, constant cold, and psychological deterioration from isolation. In confined environments, the greatest enemy is often not physical, but mental. Panic accelerates breathing. Faster breathing consumes oxygen more quickly. Reduced oxygen accelerates confusion. Confusion leads to collapse. He interrupted that cycle. He breathed slowly. He spoke softly. He prayed to keep his mind structured. He created mental order inside chaos. There is also the factor of silence. The ocean floor is not silent in an absolute sense. There are metallic creaks, vibrations, subtle water movement, but it is crushingly silent compared to the surface world. After hours in that environment, the brain begins amplifying every sound. Each vibration can feel like a threat, or like hope. When he first heard the divers, he was not sure the sounds were real. Imagine that moment. Nearly 3 days in darkness, believing perhaps no one knows you are still alive. Then a different sound. A metallic rhythm that was not there before. He did not scream wildly. He waited. And when the light finally cut through the darkness, the reaction was not dramatic hysteria. It was physical contact, a hand touching another hand. That simple gesture became one of the most striking visual records of modern survival. There is also an important technical reflection. His case demonstrated to the offshore rescue industry that the search for survivors should not be dismissed too quickly, even after long submersion periods, particularly at moderate depths and in vessels with compartmentalized structures. The concept of an air pocket was not new, but prolonged survival inside one was considered extremely unlikely. Harrison became concrete proof that, under certain conditions, the improbable can occur. Not because of supernatural intervention, but because of a convergence of factors. A structure that trapped enough air. A depth that allowed professional diving operations. Calm breathing that conserved oxygen. A trained rescue team capable of executing proper decompression procedures. What remains, ultimately, is the human meaning. 60 hours on the ocean floor is not just a number. It is 2 complete nights without knowing whether the next minute will bring respiratory failure. It is dozens of mental cycles of fear and control. It is repeated moments where the temptation to give up must be consciously rejected. He did not know whether anyone was searching for him, but he chose to act as if they were. That choice changes everything. After the rescue, life did not automatically return to normal. Trauma does not disappear simply because someone survives. He had to rebuild trust, routine, and emotional stability. Choosing to train as a diver was, symbolically, a way of transforming the ocean from a threat into knowledge. That decision completes the arc of his story in a powerful way. He entered the sea as a cook. He nearly died as a submerged castaway. He returned as someone who chose to understand the environment that tested him. Before the final conclusion, there is still one crucial element to examine. Time as the invisible enemy. When the Jaskin 4 sank, the clock immediately began working against Harrison Okene. There was no fire, no external attack. The enemy was gradual depletion, of oxygen, of body heat, of mental stability. With each passing hour, the odds decreased. First hours, shock and adaptation. Following hours, controlled breathing and the search for liquid. After 1 day, extreme fatigue. After 2 days, approaching physiological limits. After nearly 3 days, the zone where the body begins to fail quietly. He crossed that threshold. Not because he possessed superhuman physical strength, but because he managed time. He did not accelerate his breathing. He did not waste unnecessary energy. He did not allow panic to consume the available air. In that space, time was as valuable as oxygen. There is also the matter of public perception. When the rescue footage became widely known, many reacted as if it were an unexplainable miracle. But what makes this story powerful is not a violation of physics. On the contrary, it is a strict submission to physics. The air pocket existed. The space was sufficient for one person. The depth allowed technical diving operations. The rescue followed proper decompression protocols. Everything happened within real-world possibility. What was extraordinary was the rare alignment of those factors. There is a nearly philosophical dimension to this survival. Human beings depend on something invisible and simple: air. On land we do not think about it. On the ocean floor, every breath becomes a conscious act of living. For 60 hours Harrison lived breath to breath, feeling the air grow heavier, knowing the space was finite. Life reduced to its essentials: breathe, wait, believe. It is also important to remember that he did not know how many hours had passed. For him, it could have been 2 days, 4 days, or an endless stretch of time. The absence of temporal reference is one of the most severe psychological stressors. Even so, he created mental structure. He recited psalms. He spoke to himself. He organized his thoughts. In extreme situations, mental organization can replace physical tools. After the rescue, doctors confirmed that he did not suffer significant permanent neurological damage, remarkable after prolonged confinement and potential exposure to elevated CO2 levels. But emotional impact does not fade easily. He had to rebuild his relationship with the sea, and he chose to face it. That decision gives the story its final strength. He did not leave the ocean floor as a permanent victim. He emerged as a conscious survivor. There is still one quiet element that deserves attention before the final conclusion: the contrast between collective death and solitary survival. When the Jaskin 4 sank, most of the crew died. The capsizing was rapid. Many had no time to react. The initial impact, the sudden inversion, the violent rush of water, it all unfolded within minutes. And yet, in the middle of that structural collapse, one man found a space where air remained trapped. Harrison Okene was not saved by superior physical strength. He had no special equipment. No contingency plan. What separated him from immediate death was location, being in the right compartment at the right moment, and then behavior. The difference between dying in minutes and surviving for 60 hours was defined by nearly invisible details. A closed door. A space not fully flooded. A ceiling that became a floor and created an air pocket. Small structural factors that created a minimal chance. And he used that chance. There is something profoundly human in the way he faced the waiting. The mind, when confronted with extreme isolation, tends to swing between hope and despair. Each minute can feel endless. The absence of light disrupts thought. The body aches. The cold slowly erodes strength. But he established mental routine. He repeated prayers. He spoke to himself. He controlled his breathing. Repetition creates internal rhythm when the external world disappears. Survival experts often say the decisive factor is not strength, but focus. Maintaining focus on something, anything, prevents the spiral of panic. He focused on faith. It is also important to note that rescue was not immediate once divers reached the hull. Exploring a submerged ship is dangerous work. Reduced visibility, unstable structures, risk of disorientation. When the diver touched his hand, it was not only an emotional moment. It was an operational turning point. The team had to adapt instantly. Recovering a living person requires far more care than recovering a body. Harrison was integrated into a decompression protocol. That saved his life for the second time. The first was the air pocket, the second was the controlled ascent. His story also reshaped something important in the public imagination. Many assume that once a ship sinks, it becomes a sealed tomb. His case demonstrated that, under certain conditions, the interior can preserve breathable air for a significant period. But not indefinitely. 60 hours was an extreme limit. Had the rescue been delayed longer, the oxygen likely would have run out. That narrow margin between life and death is what makes the case so powerful. And after everything, he did not become a symbol of fear of the sea. He chose to confront it. He decided to train as a professional diver, learning about pressure, decompression, gas physics, the very elements that nearly killed him. That decision transforms the narrative. It is not only a story of survival. It is a story of reintegration. He did not remain trapped in that compartment forever. He left it, physically and psychologically. In the end, Harrison Okene's story is not just about a man trapped at the bottom of the sea. It is about what remains when everything else is stripped away. When the Jaskin 4 capsized and sank to a depth of about 30 meters, the world above kept moving. The ocean closed over the hull. The surface returned to calm. But inside the inverted structure, there was a man breathing what little air remained. No light. No clock. No certainty of rescue. 60 hours. His survival was not a display of physical strength. It was an extreme exercise in self-control. Every breath had to be deliberate. Every movement calculated. Oxygen slowly decreased. Carbon dioxide increased. The cold crept in. The mind threatened to fracture. He responded with mental discipline. He controlled panic. He repeated prayers. He stayed as still as possible. He turned waiting into strategy. When the diver's hand touched his in the darkness, that moment was more than relief. It was a return to the world of the living. It was proof that the hours of endurance had mattered. But survival did not end there. There had to be technique, controlled decompression, a hyperbaric chamber. Physics had to be respected. The body had to readjust to normal pressure. He left the water. And then he had to leave the darkness. There is something deeply symbolic in this story. Life reduced to its most basic element, air. In everyday life, breathing is automatic. At the bottom of the sea, breathing becomes a conscious decision. Every inhalation becomes an affirmation of existence. Harrison lived nearly 3 days counting breaths. And he chose to keep counting. His case demonstrated that air pockets can sustain life longer than many assume. It showed that rescue operations should never dismiss the improbable too quickly. It proved that the human body, when guided by a disciplined mind, can endure extraordinary extremes. But above all, it revealed something simple. The difference between giving up and holding on is often invisible to those watching from the outside. It happens in silence, in darkness, alone. After the trauma, he chose to learn about the sea. He decided to train as a professional diver. Instead of fleeing the water, he chose to understand it. That decision transforms a survival story into one of reconstruction. He entered the sea as a cook. He emerged as a survivor. He returned as someone who chose to confront his own fear. 60 hours at the bottom of the ocean are not just a statistic. They are proof that as long as there is air, and as long as the mind remains steady, life can persist even where everything seems finished. And perhaps that is the real message. It is not about a miracle. It is about breathing. It is about endurance. It is about the moment when someone in absolute darkness decides it is not over yet.